As a student of the British Bible School, you are putting on your own white coat. We expect cricket umpires to know and understand the laws of cricket and to interpret and apply them fairly and consistently. We expect a doctor to be able to identify and classify illnesses and injuries and to do so correctly and to know the appropriate treatment. You will find that some of your brothers and sisters in your home congregation will start to have expectations about you now that you are a student at the British Bible School. Some of these expectations can be unfair. The old brother or sister who has followed Jesus for many years and has heard many sermons and attended many classes should be well equipped to rightly handle the word. Many are, praise be. But some will think and say that because you are studying at a Bible school, you should know everything. I remember taking part in a village quiz. The local vicar was on one of the teams. When the question, "What is the last book in the Old Testament?" came up, all his teammates looked to him for the answer. Unfortunately, he made one of those slips we all make from time to time. He gave the answer as Revelation. Oh dear. No one else in his team challenged this. It is the vicar's job to know the books of the Bible, and now it is your job to learn them. It might be that this brings a smile of relief to your face. You have known the books of the Bible in the correct order for many years. If that is the case, then rejoice, and remember to thank whoever it was who taught you. Or perhaps you can recite the books from memory, but are less confident when it comes to the correct spellings. Maybe you are worried. Don't be. After all, there are only 66 books, and I am certain you know some of them. So try. Start with the 39 books of the Old Testament. We will look at the New Testament later. Press the pause button on your player and try to write the 39 books in the correct order. And if you are not certain about some, then have a guess. Welcome back. How did you do? If you have not already done so, check your answers in an open Bible. Pause again if you need to. A certain amount of memory work is necessary in all fields of study, some more than others. I wanted to be an actor, but I could never remember the lines. To be or not to be? What was the question? As a little light relief, listen to Tom Learer's recitation of the chemical periodic table.
There's antimony, arsenic, aluminum, selenium, and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen and rhenium, and nickel, neodymium, neptunium, germanium, and iron, americium, ruthenium, uranium, europium, zirconium, lutetium, vanadium, and lanthanum, and osmium, and astatine, and radium, and gold, protactinium, and indium, and gallium, and iodine, and thorium, and thulium, and thallium. There's yttrium, ytterbium, actinium, rubidium, and boron, gadolinium, niobium, iridium, and strontium, and silicon, and silver, and samarium, and bismuth, bromine, lithium, beryllium, and barium. There's holmium and helium and hafnium and erbium and phosphorus and francium and fluorine and terbium and manganese and mercurium, molybdenum, magnesium, dysprosium and scandium and cerium and cesium and lead, praseodymium and platinum, plutonium, palladium, promethium, potassium, polonium and tantalum, technetium, titanium, tellurium and cadmium and calcium and chromium and curium. There's sulfur, californium, and fermium, berkelium, and also mendelevium, einsteinium, nobelium, and argon, krypton, neon, radon, xenon, zinc, and rhodium, and chlorine, carbon, cobalt, copper, tungsten, tin, and sodium. These are the only ones of which the news has come to Harvard. And there may be many others, but they haven't been discovered.
No scientist needs to know the periodic table by rote. Some elements stick in the memory. You can look up the others if ever you need. It is true that the Bible student can look up any books that have been forgotten, but it is much more professional and it saves a great deal of time to know them. If you have just listed all 39 books of the Old Testament in the correct order and spelt correctly, you can pat yourself on the back and wait quietly while the rest of us catch up. There are 66 books in the Bible. Learn that fact. The Bible is divided into 2 testaments, Old and New. You knew that. There is a fun way of remembering how many books are in each, but it only works in English. Spell out the words Old Testament. O-L-D, that's 3 letters. T-E-S-T-A-M-E-N-T, that's 9. 3 and 9 together give us 39. How many books in the Old Testament? 39. Neat. And there's more. Multiply 3 by 9 and we get 27. And how many books in the New Testament? Would you believe it that there are 27? 2 more numbers to remember. So there are 39 books in the Old Testament and 27 in the New, making 66 in total. But what are they called? I am sure you know some of them already. You know that Genesis is the first book in the Bible. You probably know that Revelation is the last. And, unlike the vicar I mentioned earlier, you might know that the last book in the Old Testament is Malachi. So, that's 3. And you may well know that the first 4 books in the New Testament are Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. See? You are doing well. And I would not be surprised if you know a few more names, even if you cannot place them in the correct position, or at least not yet. You have surely sung a psalm. You have heard of Isaiah and Jeremiah, and the ones you know soon add up. In a moment, we are going to run through the 66 names in their usual order. But before we reach that point, it may be worth explaining why the order is what it is. Firstly, what it's not. The books are not arranged in alphabetical order, other than when we meet them in an alphabetically arranged reference book, such as a Bible dictionary. Alphabetical order would give us Acts to Zephaniah. Neither are they in order of length. Longest to shortest would be Psalms to, well, that would depend. 2 John has 13 verses and 3 John has 15. But 2 John has more words than 3 John, so you decide which is shortest. The books are arranged thematically, according to their subject matter, although these divisions are not absolutely watertight, but they do act as a general guide. Often the Bible is likened to a bookcase, and within each category the books are often in chronological order. So our first 5 books are the books of law, or the 5 books, the Pentateuch. In Hebrew, these 5 are called the Torah, the law, and often are called the books of Moses. They are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. From the creation in Genesis, through to the escape from Egypt in Exodus, and then laws and lists given to Moses in Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy. Don't worry about what these names mean, we will look at that later. Next we have 12 books of history. These take us from the conquest of the Promised Land under Joshua, all the way through the reigns of the kings and on to the return from captivity. In order we have Joshua, Judges, Ruth, and then our first pairing of 1st and 2nd, 1st and 2nd Samuel, followed immediately by the second set of 1st and 2nd, 1st and 2nd Kings. And then we get our final couple of 1st and 2nds for the Old Testament, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and then Ezra, Nehemiah and Esther, making 12. Before we go any further, we need to say something about these 1st and 2nds. It is rather a picky point, but it does need to be made. As you have heard, I call these books 1st and 2nd. Some prefer 1 and 2. thus 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, and so on. Neither is wrong, so pick whichever method you prefer. But be consistent, especially when writing. So if you write 1, O-N-E, as a word, or as a Latin numeral, I, or as an Arabic numeral, 1, with or without the superscript, 1 or first, it really doesn't matter. But be consistent. So if you start by writing the word, keep on writing it, at least until you've got to the end of your essay or article. Now back to the books of the Old Testament. So far we have listed 5 books of law: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then 12 historical books: Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Now we have 5 poetical books. Note the pattern: 5 books of law, 12 of history, 5 of poetry. The Hebrew poetry of the Old Testament may not look like or sound like the poetry we are used to. Let that pass for now, you will study this later. For now, learn the names and get them in the correct order. Once again, the 5 are in chronological order. Job lived before the time of Moses. Many of the Psalms are associated with David, who comes many years after Moses. And Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon are associated with David's son, Solomon. So, 5 poetical books. Now some detail. Job is spelt J-O-B and pronounced Job to rhyme with robe. Were he to seek employment, Job would look for a job, and both Job and Job are spelt the same, J-O-B. Of course, as a proper name, Job always starts with an initial capital. Psalms is another awkward word, as it starts with a silent P. To be strictly accurate, we should try to sound the P. It should sound like the PS in lips and chips. But most of us no longer even attempt to say psalm correctly, and the initial P has disappeared. Except, of course, when written. If you look for an article on Psalms in your Bible dictionary, you must turn to P, not S. We do pronounce the P in Proverbs. Ecclesiastes is a mouthful. Take care how you spell it, as there is another ancient book called Ecclesiasticus. Ecclesiastes and Ecclesiasticus are different books. Ecclesiastes, the poetical Old Testament book, is a meditation on the meaning of life, first written in Hebrew. Ecclesiasticus isn't. It was written in Greek several hundred years after Ecclesiastes. We will meet it later, but for now, stick with the Old Testament books. So, under poetry we have Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, sometimes known as Song of Songs, or in Latin, Canticles. To recap, 5 books of law, 12 of history, 5 of poetry, and next we have another set of 5, the major prophets. Major in the sense that they are longer than the minor prophets, arranged in approximate chronological order, although there is some overlap. We will look at this later. For now, learn the names and get the order right. Isaiah, or as our American friends say, Isaiah. The spelling is the same, I-S-A-I-A-H. After Isaiah, we have Jeremiah. And then a very short or minor book, Lamentations. Only 5 chapters, so not at all a major book, but written by Jeremiah, and so put next to his book. And then another 2 names, Ezekiel and Daniel. 5 major prophets, although there are really only 4 of them. And finally, another group of 12, the minor or shorter prophets. So, we have had 5 books of law, 12 of history, 5 of poetry, 5 major prophets and now 12 minor prophets. 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. 39 in total. The Jews have a useful way of remembering the minor prophets. They put all 12 on one scroll and call it the 12 prophets. For everyday use, this is good enough. Imagine you have been asked to read from the book of Jonah during a Bible study. You know that Jonah is one of the 12 and therefore comes after the major prophets and before the New Testament. So you flick through the pages until you find him. We all do it, except when we've been told to learn them by heart. So here we go. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. 12 in all. Some students like to find little memory joggers to help learn these. These are called mnemonics. Something like, he just announced, oh Jonah, my naughty hamster Zephaniah has zoomed madly. HJAOJMNHZHZM. If this sort of memory aid works for you, then go ahead and use it. Or break down the task into shorter blocks. Do not try to learn all 66 books in one go. You will end up confused and discouraged. Learn the first 5 today. Test yourself tomorrow and then learn the 12 history books. Keep building, but do not start learning the next batch until you have the previous one nailed. Many students find writing down lists helps to fix them in the memory, or chanting them aloud, or even setting them to music. I used to write lists on pieces of card and carry them around in my pocket. Many years ago, you could have seen me walking to school in the morning, muttering to myself, and then glancing at a card. That was me learning my memory work. You need to find a way that works for you and then make it work. It will take time, but it is worth it. You may now want to switch off this presentation and not come back until you have got the 39 books of the Old Testament well and truly memorised. If you are confident that you have done this, or that you are almost there, then by all means continue into the New Testament. For most of us, this is easier. Partly because there are fewer books, 27 as opposed to 39, partly because most of us know our New Testament better than the Old, and partly because the minor prophets are in the Old Testament, not the New. So, have a go. Pause this presentation and write, from memory, the 27 books of the New Testament. How did you do? Pause again and check, and then we will go through them together. We start with 4 Gospels. Gospel comes from the Old English good news. In one sense, there is only one Gospel, the good news about Jesus. But we have 4 accounts by 4 witnesses. Indeed, the usual Greek titles are kata, according to, followed by the name of the writer. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Why this order? Some scholars believe that Matthew was the first to write. This is by no means impossible, but it is also by no means the majority view. What is certain is the fact that Matthew's Gospel is the longest of the 4. In ancient times, when all Bibles were written and copied by hand, putting the longest first could be a useful decision, as it meant that should the scribe have to cut short the copying after just one book, by having the longest, the readers would learn the most about Jesus. Nearly everything Mark records can also be found in Matthew. But there is also a theological reason for putting Matthew first. His is the most Jewish gospel, and therefore nearest to the Old Testament. More fulfilled prophecies are recorded by Matthew. Matthew records 5 sermons preached by Jesus. Some think this is a conscious parallel with the 5 books of Moses. And there is much more, but this belongs in another course. For now, remember that Matthew comes first. Mark, the shortest of the 4, follows him. And according to most experts, Mark was the first to be written down. Together, Matthew, Mark and Luke are often described as synoptic. This comes from the Greek and means seen together. Matthew, Mark and Luke approach the task of writing a gospel from a similar perspective. The 4th gospel, by John, looks at Jesus in a different way. Only John calls Jesus the Word. Only John records Jesus using the phrase, I am. John has no parables. The miracles recorded by John tend not to be found in the synoptics, and so on. This is another subject that you will examine later. For now, Matthew is first, as his gospel is certainly the longest and seems to be the most Jewish. Mark comes next, as he was probably the first to be written. Then comes Luke, the 3rd of the synoptics, and the only writer to compose a sequel to his gospel, the Book of Acts. But between Luke part 1, the Gospel of Luke, and 2nd Luke, Acts, we have the non-synoptic Gospel, John. So we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts, 4 Gospels and a history book. Or, if you wish to describe the Gospels as history, 5 books of history. 4 biographies, the history of a person, Jesus, and 1 history of his church, the Acts of the Apostles, as it is called, although to be strictly accurate, it might be better known as some of the Acts of some of the Apostles, as you will see for yourself when you read it. So, we have 4 Gospels followed by Acts. And now we come to the biggest category in the New Testament, the letters or epistles. Some say that letter and epistle are synonyms, words that mean the same thing, but others argue that there is a technical difference here. Epistles were letters that were written to be read aloud. Another topic to examine later. For now, you've guessed it, learn them. The first batch of letters is from Paul and have letters taken from the destination. First come letters to congregations and then letters to individuals, all arranged in approximate order of length. So, Romans, with 16 chapters, comes first. Then we have the 2 letters to Corinth, 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Then a letter to the Christians in Galatia, Galatians. Then one to the brethren in Ephesus, Ephesians. Next, Philippi, Philippians, and Colossae, Colossians. And then 2 to Thessalonica, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, making 9 letters from Paul to 7 different destinations. Don't forget the 2 to Corinth and the 2 to Thessalonica. Now we have letters from Paul to people. We start with 2 to Timothy, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and 1 to Titus, and 1 to Philemon. So 9 letters to places, and 4 letters to people, making 13. The next letter is to Jewish Christians, and is always known as Hebrews. There is a good case to be made for saying that this too is by Paul, but written anonymously. And there is an equally strong case for saying it isn't. That must wait, but it does explain why Hebrews is collected with Paul's other letters without being part of them. It is open to discussion. All the other letters have the names of the writers. So we have a letter by James, 2 by Peter, 1st and 2nd Peter, 3 by John, 1st, 2nd and 3rd John, and this is the only 3rd anything in the Bible, and 1 by Jude. And that leaves just 1 more book, the last one in the Bible, and one in a class of its own. The type of writing is apocalyptic. Some would say that this is a form of prophecy. In its way, it is also poetic, and it starts with 7 letters to 7 churches. It is the book of Revelation. Note that Revelation is singular. It is not Revelations. Sometimes it is called the Revelation of John or the Revelation to John, but for this course, Revelation is sufficient. And there we have it. 66 books in the correct order and spelt correctly, all placed within the appropriate categories in our Bible library. And now all you need to do is learn these facts. So off you go and start work. Thank you.